In our reading from Deuteronomy, Moses is speaking to the Hebrew people. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, "Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die." Then the Lord replied to me, "They are right in what they have said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you, from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. Anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die." Turning now to the first chapter in Mark's Gospel. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding regions of Galilee. Your word, O Lord, is a lamp to our feet.
Thank you, Ross. Graham will now speak to us. Rex Graham will now. I'm making a few boo-boos today.
I understand there's an Alf Graham amongst us. Don't know whether we're related. There he is. Someone's pointing him out. Neither of us are related to Billy Graham, I think. But good to be here again in a time in January when Graham and family can have a break away, and they've had a good time, I understand. So we sort of have this unwritten agreement that I front up every January for one of the services as a relief preacher, and that's good. I'm happy to do that. Way back in 1597, that's over 400 years ago, a great British philosopher, Sir Francis Bacon, wrote, "Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power." He probably didn't realise how prescient his comments were over 400 years later in our day. If you are a very elderly person living alone, with not much other support, and you don't have a computer, you don't have a mobile phone, and you don't have an internet. That was the case for my mother there before she passed away a few years ago. You can't receive bills, probably some might like this, electronically. You can't pay for them electronically. And maybe the electricity company might even want to charge you for sending an account through the post. Well, in that case, that's the reverse of knowledge is power. Lack of knowledge, and the phone, the internet are such great sources of knowledge, aren't they? And information today. Without that, it leads to powerlessness. Many social commentators, in fact, are worried about the personal knowledge that big tech companies like Facebook, now called Meta, Google and others, the knowledge that they have about us, they describe it as personal data. Some worry that these big tech companies know more about us than we know about ourselves. Our preferences for certain consumer goods, music and so on and so forth, maybe our cultural, religious and political sensibilities. And this knowledge, this data as it's called, it's powerful because it raises an enormous amount of revenue through the web and social media. Eventually some predict the more dire profits that, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, add artificial intelligence into the mix and they'll rule the world, these companies. Such is their power. Well, we have in the English language a word for knowledge and power. It's called authority. Actually, the word authority in English has many meanings, like a lot of our words. I counted 8. Quick look at the Macquarie Dictionary. But in every case, I found that behind the word authority, there lay power and knowledge, and often both. Well, in our reading in Mark's Gospel this morning, this word authority is a crucial word for our understanding of what Mark wants us to understand about Jesus. Our reading was from the first chapter of Mark, as Ross read, and it's at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And prior to this, Mark has outlined a few preparatory steps that Jesus took privately, pretty much. He was baptised by John the Baptist in the Jordan and therefore called to his mission and ministry. He was led out into the wilderness and he repudiated 3 strategies, and then he selected a group of people of kindred spirits, 12 men in that day, to support him and to learn and to assist him in his ministry. But they were all fairly private, behind the scenes stuff, you might say. The first public action that Mark records is to teach in the synagogue, for Jesus to teach in the local church at Capernaum in Galilee. That's about 40 kilometres from where Jesus grew up. Remember, Galilee's up in the north, Jerusalem down south. Mark records a very interesting response then by the congregation to Jesus' initial teaching. Quote, "They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes." Jesus taught as one having authority. He might have said as one having knowledge and power. But to help us understand what Mark has in mind using these words, having authority, he adds, and not as the scribes. They were astounded from what he taught as having authority, but not as the scribes. Now hold on. Some of you will say, who know well your New Testament background, the culture and the history of the place. These scribes had knowledge and power, i.e. authority, in spades, didn't they? As one biblical scholar put it, scribes in Jesus' time were, I quote, a highly skilled literate class who could read and write complex religious and legal documents. Most worked for the powerful and wealthy elite. So these scribes were highly trained lawyers in the employ of the Jewish ruling class in Israel, in the capital, in Jerusalem, in the capital of Israel down south. And given their training and position at the top of the food chain, we'd say these days, they were surely the epitome of authority. Gilbert and Sullivan would say they are the very model of the modern Major General in law. Knowledge, power and knowledge par excellence, one might think. Jesus' congregation that day in the synagogue would have thought that. The Sanhedrin, the ruling class based in the temple in Jerusalem down south, employed lots of scribes. The sort of equivalents today may be the legally trained bureaucrats in Parliament House in Canberra, in our capital, maybe in the Home Affairs Department under the employ of Mr. Bazzulo before he was sacked. But the scribes in Israel's capital differed from our bureaucrats in Canberra. You see, not only did they draft laws, but the temple sent the scribes out into the regions, up north into Galilee and other places across the Jordan, to teach about the law and no doubt to check that it was being followed, for they had a big part in enforcing the law. And of course this teaching included speaking in synagogues throughout Galilee and other parts of Israel. By the way, another interesting fact, the president of the synagogue was the one who decided who would teach. In those days, they didn't have a resident minister or priest who was the regular preacher. That explains how Jesus got an invite. Anyway, real political, cultural and social power resided with these scribes. And as to knowledge, rather than power, their knowledge about the law, so important in Jewish society, and their expertise in applying the law, it was second to none. And yet here is Mark writing that compared to Jesus, the teaching of these much venerated scribes lacked authority. Goodness me, Mark. Wash your mouth out with soap. This is heresy. Mark's questioning their authority it's an astonishing affront to the orthodoxy of the day, the dominant view about how society should be run and governed, which was pushed and promoted by the temple, the virtually the equivalent of the High Court and the Parliament and everything else wrapped together down in Jerusalem. I mean to say that the scribes lacked authority, for most people to hear that would be an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. A bit like the fellow that was overheard once having a heated argument with someone, and he said, if you're going to be a hypocrite, at least be a sincere one. Sincere hypocrite? Hard circle to square, isn't it? Well, it seems that Mark sensed that his readers would be perplexed and would struggle to understand what he was saying about Jesus teaching with authority and the scribes teaching with little authority. So Mark tells us that teaching was not the only activity that was carried on in the synagogue that Saturday morning, but also one of Jesus' many healings occurred. He records Jesus performing an exorcism of a man who happened to be in the synagogue on that day when Jesus was teaching. Now, exorcism, I would define that as the practice of evicting demons from either a person or a place. Exorcism, that opens a Pandora's box for someone like me in this situation, as to what each of us makes of it and what we make of the causes of ill health. Time doesn't permit to go into a discussion about demonology versus medical science. But I'll make a few comments. Firstly, when I have an illness, I consult a medical science educated GP, not an exorcist, as I assume pretty well everyone here of us does today. However, in Jesus' time, demons were thought to be everywhere, and particularly in the sea, but everywhere, and they were the cause of illness and of everything bad in the world, pretty much. And even today, in Guatemala, in Central America, in Brazil, in South America, in African countries like Nigeria, belief in demons is quite common. Closer even than that to home, in Papua New Guinea's parliament, in 2013, the Speaker of the House moved to destroy the special carvings that were hanging in the Parliament House of PNG. They were the symbols of the country's traditional culture, because he said, the Speaker said, in his view, they were demonic. And thirdly, notice that the man at the synagogue, when he's talking with Jesus, spoke in the plural we. Did you notice that? His first words to Jesus are, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" Now, a psychiatrist reading that, it would ring bells for a psychiatrist as to whether this person suffers from what they now call dissociative identity disorder, where patients have, quote, 2 or more distinct identities or personality states. That's quoting DSM-4 for those interested. And so they will talk in different times according to which personality they are in at the time. But here's the thing. Mark records this healing miracle by Jesus here in the synagogue because he wants us to see that Jesus speaking, Jesus' authority, includes the power of God. Not the power of the temple, not the power of the Sanhedrin, nor the power of associated professions like the law or medicine or clergy, dare I say. Jesus' authority includes the power of God to liberate humans from all that would suppress and subjugate and limit and constrain human flourishing and humans living full and complete lives. So this is part of the answer to our question of the different authority of Jesus to that of the scribes. Regarding the power side of things, which we are focusing on at the moment, we'll come to knowledge in a minute. Regarding the power side of things, Jesus' authority is such that those people who attach themselves to Jesus, who encounter Jesus, who take notice of Jesus, who are loyal to him, will be in touch with and access the power of God's love in their lives. And this power of God's love is stronger than any earthly power. The power is stronger than any power of evil that harms and injures humans. And so the crowd, after the healing, say, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, the evil demons, and they obey him." We need to remind ourselves of this power, you know. God calls us to face up to the reality of life. And life, the reality is life can be quite brutal. Ask the people of Israel and Gaza and Ukraine today, or even our fellow New South Welsh people in Lismore after those terrible floods of last year. Thankfully avoided in Townsville just this week with Cyclone Kirrily. Evil, natural or man-made, can seem overpowering if we face up to it, can't it? As Jesus faced up to evil in the synagogue that day. But in a church discussion group only a matter of a few weeks ago now, one or two people commented that they no longer watch the news or read about the news. So much is bad is happening in the world, they said. It was too emotionally overwhelming. I got the impression of a tendency to despair and to be depressed. And we can understand this, can't we? And so we are tempted to shield ourselves rather than face up to the reality of evil in the world. When I participate in campaigns, as is my habit since 2010, campaigns against the fossil fuel industry and carbon pollution, causing floods and fires, droughts, heat waves, much suffering and hardship, it's hard not to be overwhelmed by what is the biggest and most powerful industry that has ever existed, the fossil fuel industry. Bill McKibben's a Methodist layperson in the US and an environmentalist, and he has calculated that the fossil fuel industry is worth $23,000 billion. Hugely powerful and entrenched. But what keeps me participating in the Move Beyond Coal movement, as I was and others last year? What keeps us participating against these odds? Because my loyalty to Jesus means I know that I'm connected to the power of God's love in the world. And not even the fossil fuels, economic and political power, can match the power of God's love in the world. Fossil fuels will be overcome. They will largely die out. We'll keep some. They will be replaced by renewables for the sake, out of love for, our grandchildren and their children. So, the above, what I've just been discussing, it's an important aspect of the power dimension of Jesus' authority. What about quickly, as we come to a close, the knowledge dimension? Authority, we recall, is about power and knowledge. Well, that reading from the Old Testament, Moses' words, help us here. He promises that God in the future, and many years ago he promised, thousands, that God will provide a prophet who will guide God's people in new situations. The Lord will raise up a prophet, he said, like me from among your people. You shall heed such a prophet. And he repeats the line 3 verses later. A prophet like you, quoting God now, like you, Moses, will be raised up from among their own people, he says. And I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet. So God in past times promised one who would be God's spokesperson, from among his own people. Now I'm afraid these scribes, as I've described them to you, these drafters of the law, these people who work for the powerful and wealthy elites in the capital Jerusalem, they don't sound to me what Moses had in mind when he promised a future spokesperson for God. They had lots of knowledge, all right. I could wax lyrical for ages about their minute detail of the law, things like what constitutes swearing an oath that is permissible and what is not, what constitutes breaking the Sabbath and what is not, and on, and they enforced these laws. We can conclude quite reasonably, I think, that this concentration on the law and considering who employed them, that they were supporting the status quo, the dominant consciousness of the day. that what the leaders in Jerusalem wanted the people to believe and to understand. After all, who employs a lawyer to argue against them? Nobody. Donald Trump doesn't deploy all his lawyers to argue against him, does he? So the scribes, the key element of their role was to maintain the hold over the people and to exert control. Contrast that with Jesus, who grew up in Galilee, a local, in Nazareth, speaking on behalf of God about God's love for humanity and how God calls us to reproduce that love in our love for others in our lives. Little wonder the crowd said, "What? A new teaching?" New, all right, compared with what the scribes were teaching. This teaching of Jesus, inspired by the Holy Spirit, it just put aside this vast network of laws promulgated by the scribes, which would never change anything much at all and leave the people in their current situation. This is the great insight of Jesus of Nazareth. The great knowledge of Jesus is that compassion for our fellow human beings, now and those who will come after us, compassion for them trumps all other asks that God makes of us. So, the authority of Jesus Christ. No better authority exists, does it? Not the authority of the government, not the authority we so easily give these days to celebrities and influencers, they're called, on social media. No corporation spruiking the latest and greatest product. In Jesus, no better or truer source of knowledge and power to guide our lives exists. And for that, thanks be to God. Amen.